so we'll go on to our last. I wasn't sure if the last two items could be taken together. Is that the thinking? So, if you all want to come up, we've got last items are the land development code revision that involves transportation elements, and then the street impact fee study update. Street impact fee is part of the land development code. I think the thinking here was just to help us start to get up to, just to start to remember the draft 3 starting point for the transportation section, not parking. We've already had plenty of conversation about parking, but the other kinds of elements that are in there. So, and I know the street impact fee is a big part of that. So I'll let our staff take us through this conversation. And let me do a time check, too. We're supposed to quit at 3. Does everybody have a hard stop at 3, or are y'all open to... We may have a hard stop at 3.
Let's just stick with 3 and see how we do.
Okay, we're going to try for a hard stop at 3. And there's so much to talk about in these areas, so we can always talk more at the next meeting. Okay. So, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Anique.
Hi, Anique Baudet, Austin Transportation Department, joined with Brent Lloyd, Development Services, and Danielle Morin, also Austin Transportation Department. So for the Land Development Code rewrite item, I'm going to thank you for your specificity on wanting to understand right-of-way dedication, which I imagine is a question after the 2 years. Thank you for your time looking at the strategic mobility plan and the roadway table that was adopted with it, with the new right-of-way requirements to realize the goals in the plan. And so the question becomes, where did Code Next leave off on right-of-way dedication, TIAs, which was the other item asked for, and transportation demand management, which you all just heard an hour ago a lot about some incentives in TDM. So I am going to give you a brief overview of where Code Next left off on those 3 items, because we in transportation live and breathe those 3 things all the time, but you all do a lot of other things, and so I welcome the opportunity to refresh. And Councilmember Ellis, you weren't here the last time around, so to refresh y'all on those 3 things, and then I'll be here to answer questions, and Brent and Danielle will chime in as they would like with more detail. So, with regards to right-of-way dedication, our current code allows us to require right-of-way dedication at the various stages of development. That requirement carried through to the Code Next process with specific language. I'm reading exactly from where we left off. A landowner shall dedicate all public right-of-way required to adequately serve the transportation needs of proposed development consistent with the standards of this title. The amount, location, and alignment of right-of-way to be dedicated shall conform to the transportation plan. So we now have an updated plan, and this language is proposed at this point in time to carry through to the current Land Development Code rewrite. So if there's any questions about that, we can pause now, or I can go on to TIA or TDM. Okay. So
let's go ahead and go through it.
Okay. So again, right-of-way dedication, a tool that we rely on a lot, carrying through to the current LDC rewrite process. For transportation impact analysis and transportation demand management requirements, where we left off with Code Next was a new section titled Comprehensive Transportation Review. And the difference from the current code was that we were taking a TDM, transportation demand management first approach to how we mitigate traffic through the development process, meaning we lowered the trigger for the transportation impact analysis from 2,000 trips to 1,000. That's where we left off, with the requirement to look at transportation demand management tools to initially lower those trips as much as possible, because what we know from 2016 and being advised by Jeff Tumlin and the Year of Mobility is that transportation demand management is the quickest, most cost-effective way to manage our congestion. So that's the approach we took with the code to codify that requirement. Then with the hopes that the TIA, the raw trips that were left would be the analysis itself would be less cumbersome. There would be less trips to mitigate with regards to the supply side. So that was the approach we were taking. Now, in the last year, we have learned a lot. We have entered into a memorandum of understanding with DSD with regards to clarifying roles and responsibilities in the review process. The neighborhoods, development community have all learned a lot more about what TDM is, and the development community is asking to do more of it on their own voluntarily. So we have had a lot of precedent of cases of doing TDM through the development process, which will be very useful as we go into the code rewrite and start to refine how we codify it. So that's all I have. Does anyone want to add anything to that? That's a very high-level refresher of the approach we were taking with Code Next and how we're going to continue to do that, but use the hindsight as 2020 and the experiences we've had.
Okay, let's take a few questions on that before we move to the street impact fee. You had some questions.
Yeah, I mean, just generally, I remember conversations with a lot of folks that felt anxiety over the lack of definition of TDM in what was being proposed. And, you know, folks always imagine the worst possible scenario if left to their own devices. So how much of this do we expect to be actually in the code that's approved by council so that we can be assured that, say, we're not using rules that are going to inhibit our unit production? Because obviously the council has made it very clear that the number of units is a primary metric for success in this process.
Good question, and I'm just refreshing looking at the language that was here, and predictability is really important. There is a menu of items that are considered transportation demand management. Most of that will be in the transportation criteria manual. So the trigger that you must do a TDM plan or that you can do one voluntarily would be in the code. There might be some tools that are appropriate to codify. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head right now what they would be, but might be appropriate, and we'll be fleshing that out in the leadership
I remember
team.
getting into this conflict of wanting to have an example criteria manual or see a draft criteria manual, and then the pushback was, well, you don't do that until you pass the code. You don't write that until the code is passed. That comes next. And then just, so I don't have, nor expect you to have an answer right now, but I think this is one of the, I don't know how to solve this, and I'm hopeful we can find a way to solve this. And then with the lowering of the threshold from 2,000 to 1,000, you know, getting a better understanding of how that's going to impact affordable housing developers or other types of smaller scale developments that we are also trying to prioritize in this new code. And there are things that, you know, since we didn't do that type of detailed policy direction before Code Next happened, now I think it's clearer what the council's looking for and its outcomes. So I'm hopeful that this transportation section can address those concerns. I have a whole other list of stuff that's not necessarily what we're posted to talk about in the transportation chapter, and things about sidewalks and things that I'm seeing in my district about why the sidewalk was required to be built there and not over here, and things like that that are maybe a Rodney or DSD conversation too.
Okay, and what we could do if folks would like to do that is at our August meeting or September meeting, drill down into some additional areas of the code if we want to. Yeah.
And I don't know that we know as a council yet how the staff's going to start rolling out the work.
That's right. Yeah.
We may have a draft transportation chapter at some point we can start combing through.
Okay.
So we'll see, yeah. But I think ongoing conversation is probably a good idea.
Okay, Councilmember Alton.
Thank you. Ms. Widow, I was just wondering if you could go through the last part of what you said about what you'd learned in hindsight over the year from when we did Code Next. I didn't quite digest that.
Yeah, so we have been on larger developments, really mid-sized to larger developments. We've been requiring, looking at parking pretty seriously with developers and trying to utilize existing code 256478, which is parking reductions general that allows for 20% reduction if you're in the urban core automatically, and other types of reductions if you do certain things. We learned, for example, in the East Riverside area that you can do a 65 or up to 50% reduction, and trying to understand, parking has been a big part of what we've been learning of what reductions are feasible with regards to performas from the developers and that type of thing, because parking, per y'all's direction on May 2nd is something that we're going to have to really double down on as far as a TDM measure, so, and an affordability measure. And so we've been learning a lot about, what is the tolerance for market parking. So that would be one area that we've learned a lot about in the last year that will help us with the direction that was given on May 2nd. Is there anything else, Danielle? You've been working a lot on TDM with some developments of mid to large size that you wanted to add.
I don't think there's anything specific to add, but I will just say that, as we have these large developments that come in, we're learning about the TDM measures, that some are feasible, some are not, what we can and can't enforce, and what, Austin can support. So I think that's been an important.
And I think Brent Lloyd, DSD, I think there have been enforceability questions. And so I think one of the things that was attempted to be done in draft 3, and we're going to try to shore this up in the version that comes back to council later, is really building in some enforceability triggers, doing more to make TDM measures really a condition to site plans, having them documented in a manner that they will be enforceable. There's definitely been some situations in the recent past where TDM is really important, but it's sort of a freestanding document that isn't really married in a very tight way to an application or an approval. So we're going to really be looking at ways to make TDM more of a standard code requirement that has that enforceability triggers.
Thank you. I don't remember if it was in ASMP or in the Land Development Code, but I remember putting in some language about enforceability for TDM. So I'm glad to hear that's the direction that you're going. So part of it is, if I'm understanding what you're suggesting, is that the market may be saying that reductions of a certain level may not be feasible given what the market is demanding to have as a target. Is that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you.
A question about traffic impact analysis. I've heard the methodology can sometimes work against our sustainable mode shifting goals. If we talk about level of service, you're kind of talking about number of cars on the road, and I was wondering if you could speak about that a little bit, or if there's any alternatives to TIAs that that your department's considering as we look at transit supportive densities for the new code rewrite that will be coming forward.
Yeah, good question. So we have current updated TIA guidelines that, the current code requires the TIA to certain trigger, and then we have guidelines that are in the Transportation Criteria Manual that we've also created some supplemental clarification to what is in the Transportation Criteria Manual. And in that, it is very much focused on multimodal. The current TCM allows for a multimodal review, but in practice, historically, we hadn't been developing what that really looks like in practice for the TIA. So we, through our Transportation Engineering Division, we've done a lot of work in the last year, actually 2 years, in being more multimodal focused. And so we will be taking those guidelines as we look at this current code rewrite version and seeing what makes sense, working very closely with the Transportation Department, what makes sense to codify and what makes sense to continue to keep in the TCM, and then update the TCM. And so to Councilmember Flanagan's point, what's good with this current, where we are now with the code rewrite, is that we have our TCM at 60% complete, which we didn't a year ago, which will help a lot with the conversation, as you pointed out, Councilmember Flanagan, of not understanding what that transportation demand management criteria will be. What is the trip reduction if you do this method or that method? What is the cost versus the trip reduction, that sort of thing. So we're a lot further along than we were a year ago in that sort of transparency, which is great with regards to what we're trying to do with a modernized transportation chapter. So, to your question, we are looking at best practice and different methodologies. level of service is still a tool that can be used by the engineers as we look holistically, but it's not the only tool.
Okay.
And so we are looking
good.
to, utilize a lot of other perspectives on the transportation mitigation.
And so has that transportation criteria manual been updated in the past year?
No, the work is underway to take it through update within the next year. We hope to have 90% complete by the end of the year. And so, again, it'll be really healthy, I think, for those who are really looking at the transportation chapter to have that going concurrently.
Okay, that sounds great, and I'm excited you're doing it. It may be of help for me especially to kind of see what's been updated, just
Okay.
if that's a way to either just get with my office so I can kind of see what has been updated and exactly what points y'all were working on. It'll help
For the
me
criteria
understand that.
manual, to be clear?
Yeah,
Okay,
the TCM.
sure.
Okay, why don't we shift now to the, do we have time to cover the street impact fee, or do y'all? Oh, wow, she said, yes, okay.
Thank you all very
When
much.
you're at the end of the, sorry, Anika, when you're at the end of the agenda, you estimate that you have less time. I think my wager was 3 minutes, so you've given
We
me.
have more than 3 minutes for you.
I don't really need it. I could give you a more thorough recap of where we've been on the street impact fee program. Leanne Miller, Austin Transportation. But I will cut to the chase. You have received a memo yesterday that provides a backup on where we've been, the work that's been done to date, and next steps. Provides a lot of links to resources where you can kind of go back and refresh. And for you, Councilmember Ellis, since you weren't here when we were back at council in 2017, kind of see the work that's already been done. And there's a report of study assumptions that's also available to review. So what I'm really here to tell you today is that the street impact fee study is moving forward. It was on hold while we were working on the strategic mobility plan and vetting the roadway capacity projects as part of the ASMP. Now that we've gotten council adoption of the ASMP, we want to move forward with the street impact fee study. So just jumping to the schedule overall, we started the process back in late 2016. We brought land use assumptions or our growth projections for the next 10 years to council in October 2017, held a public hearing. Then we moved into developing those roadway capacity projects. We got public feedback on those projects through the ASMP, and now we want to bring to council those assumptions in total, the growth projections and the roadway capacity projects, because those are really the basis for the calculation of what an impact fee would be. Very simply, you take the cost of all of the projects, you divide it by the growth in terms of new service units, what is the new vehicle miles that has been generated by that growth, and that's what gets you a maximum fee in each service area. If you remember, state law limits the size of the service areas, so that translated for Austin to having 17 unique service areas. So there would be a unique impact fee for residential and non-residential uses in each service area. So what we're hoping is that we can get council approval of these study assumptions so that we have confidence moving into that calculation so that we can then bring back what that maximum assessable fee is and some potential policy choices for council to make in phase 3. So there's an item on your agenda next week, June 20th, to set a public hearing. That's the state required public hearing, setting that for August or whatever date you think is appropriate, and then to ask for council approval of the study assumptions. So that's not an adoption of a fee, but it's kind of adoption of the work that's been done, the technical analysis that would help us have confidence in moving into that calculation phase. The only other thing that I'd like to mention is on the transportation criteria manual. I think Anik summed it up well in that we have a strategic mobility plan, we have a land development code, we've made process changes in development review, where we're updating our transportation criteria manual, we're proposing a potential street impact fee. Together, all of these things are going to make for a much better process when it comes to assessing impacts of growth and making sure that growth is paying for growth in an equitable, predictable, and transparent way. So the transportation criteria manual is something that we had started updating when Code Next was underway, and we've been working on it, and we'll have an item again on your June 20th agenda for some contract authorization to continue the work on the transportation criteria manual. So just wanted to let you know that that's another item that will help move forward on that project, to especially dig in on the TDM section, so that those TDM requirements are very clear in the criteria manual, since that was, we know, a concern in the last process. So really, that is it. So I might have done it in 3 minutes.
Good job.
Yeah.
Okay, questions? Councilman Ellis, you want to go first?
Yeah, just off the top of my head, if we're talking about knowing how new growth affects our traffic, where's the flexibility in the shift to multimodal? Like, how do you count that number if you have people who are trying to give up the single occupant trips and move into a bus system or riding their bike?
Right. That's definitely a reduction that we can calculate into the impact fee. So we can say this is what's maximum accessible based on if we were to assume no trips, were removed off of the roadway system, and then we can do a reduction for TDM measures, and that's something that we would bring back to council as part of that phase 3 of how we would propose to do that, and how that would work in concert with the new TIA and TDM first approach with the Land Development Code rewrite.
Okay, yeah, I think those go in partnership well together. And
Yes,
since we've given
they do.
direction on giving up car dependency a little bit, great timing.
Yes. It's almost like we planned it.
It's wild. Okay, I'll let someone else.
Councilmember Alton?
Hopefully this is an easy question. I'm just wondering, since we haven't finished the land development code and we're doing the street impact fee, and there's quite a lot more growth in the direction than was anticipated previously, how does that play into the process?
Yes, we anticipated that question. So the land use assumptions were developed in 2017, looking at a lot of different factors. And again, we were looking at a 10-year time frame, looking at Imagine Austin growth concept, a future land use map, looking at our projections that we have from the demographer, working in concert with our Austin Water Department, who was at the time updating their impact fee study, and so we compared notes. We also looked at the strategic housing blueprints, projections for housing needs. So all of those things together were taken into consideration in the development of the land use assumptions. That said, the study can be updated at any point in time. It's required to be updated every 5 years. So since we're looking at a 10-year time period, and a lot of that growth is actually allocated towards emerging development projects that we know about today, the Development Services Department does a very good job of tracking what all of those projects are. We can say confidently that we feel that those assumptions are reasonable in a 10-year period, and then at the 5-year mark, when a study update would be required, we could reevaluate those assumptions and make changes based on any land development code changes that we felt like would dramatically change the growth projections. But we're looking really based on growth trends and all those other kind of pieces of information that we have to look into our crystal ball and project growth.
And then if anyone wanted to look at those, they're available in that
Yes.
street impact fee support.
Yes,
Document.
yes, and
Okay.
that lays out the methodology and what the final results are. If there's a desire to see a lot more detail on the methodology, we have that. It's a more technical document. We can provide that as well.
Okay, thank you.
So just to confirm, the council, next step from the council perspective is to vote on the assumptions.
Correct.
And those are in the report that you provided to us.
Yes.
Okay. And the timeline for that is thinking sometime in August
August 8th was the date that we proposed in the RCA, but
for a public hearing and vote.
yes.
Okay. And then after that, we would then vote later in the process after you go back and do the calculations on the fee.
Correct.
And that also entails, when you calculate the fee, options that we might have for adjusting the fee for various factors, like the one that Councilmember Ellis talked about. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yes.
In terms of timeline. Do you have any idea about the timeline between adopting the assumptions and coming back to us on The fees order of magnitude, is that months and months, or is it?
I think it's months, whether,
Okay.
that would happen, I think, depending on where the council is in the land development code. We know that those, items may not be desired to be discussed at the same time, so we may,
Okay.
kind of wait for that to conclude.
Okay.
But I would say towards the end of the year, beginning of next year would be our target.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. I know that we'll probably have a lot of questions about the assumptions, and we
Yeah.
can send those to you and have conversations about them.
Absolutely. Thank you.